before we talk about the language domains related to language disorders, let's review what they are. So phonology is how sounds are organized into patterns that underlie language. These are different from the phonological disorders that we talked about with speech-sound disorders because it's not related just to the production of sounds. It can also relate to reading and writing those sounds and putting them into words. Morphology is how words are formed out of the more basic elements. So once we've got our base word, how can we change that word into different words to create new meanings? And then we have syntax, that's the arrangement of words to form meaningful sentences, which is a part of grammar. This is to say Sally and Susie play ball versus play ball, Sally and Susie, or ball, Sally, Susie play, which doesn't make much sense, so it violates the terms of syntax. And we have semantics, which is the meanings that the words, the phrases, and the sentences convey. And this can go back to having command or directions, or otherwise. Then we have pragmatics, which is the use of language in our social situations. What I want you to keep in mind is that as a child develops, we haven't focused so much on each individual age that a child is during these language disorders. But as a whole, a child can support themselves either pragmatically or academically with their language skills until their skills cannot no longer support their demands. So if you think about a child who makes it to 3rd or 4th grade and they're making all A's and suddenly they have C's in 5th grade, think about what they're asked to do in 5th grade that's different from what they were asked to do in 4th grade. You're starting to look more at abstract language. You're starting to read more or longer books with bigger sentences or bigger paragraphs. The pictures that provide context are taken away. And then when they go into middle school, they're really getting into more of that abstract language. They're starting to read poems, and they have to interpret that meaning. And then once they get to high school, they're starting to read Shakespeare, which is not only poems, but fully abstract meaning, and interpreting that meaning in the environment and the emotions and the movement of the people in the play. And it really can become more challenging for these students. From the social side of things, they're also being asked to communicate with people who are not just their peers, not just their age group. They're starting to communicate more with their teachers, with their bosses. And so the breakdown in their language can really occur later in their language development than if it were earlier on, simply because they haven't had that foundational skill to support those harder challenges. So what we're going to go through now is just the different types or characteristics that a child could display with the different domains of language for the receptive or expressive language delay. Now this is just a very small list of problems that a child could have. It's not a comprehensive list by any means, but just to give you an idea of how each individual area can impact language production or language understanding. So for phonology, we're looking at how those sounds are organized into patterns that underlie language. So again, we're still talking about sounds just like we were in speech-sound disorders, but now we're really looking at the meaning of those sounds. So on the receptive side, children with phonological disorders in the language area can have problems learning speech sounds. And you might go, well, that kind of sounds like a speech-sound disorder, and you're fairly correct. Phonological disorders do tend to reflect in language disorders if a child has a speech-sound disorder that is of the phonological error type, meaning that they are at higher risk of a language disorder if they produce phonological errors. These children can also have poor word repetition, so you might ask them to say banana, and they might go ba-ba-ba-ba, banana, ba-da-ba-da, ba-banana. Okay, kind of takes them a minute to get there, or they can't coordinate those sound patterns. On the expressive side, they can have difficulty rhyming. So think about what rhyming is and how it relates to phonemes. If we listen to the words cat and hat, we both have 3 phonemes. We have k, a, t, and h, a, t. The only phoneme difference is between the k and the h. A child with a phonological disorder in language can have difficulty differentiating between the 2 sounds and not understand that the words rhyme. These children can also delete sounds or syllables in words or have difficulty blending sounds. So if I give them the cue, What is the word that sounds like this? S, e, n, d. They might not understand that it's sand. They can also have difficulty segmenting those words. So if I say, tell me the sounds in sand, they go s, e, n, sand. And they can't quite segment those sounds all the way out. Think about how this could be impacting reading ability. You have to understand the difference between words when you're looking at them or when you're listening to somebody as well. But especially when you're looking at words and reading them, knowing the difference between cat and hat. If you don't have the context of the picture, can you tell the difference between the words if you can't tell the difference between the sounds? For morphological errors, we're looking at how the words are formed and changing the meaning by adding more morphemes. So for children with morphological errors, they could have difficulty recalling sentences or difficulty following a story. And think about stories and how storytelling happens. You're talking about something that either happened in the future or happened in the past. And you're using your morphemes to change the meaning of those words to indicate that it happened in the past or it's going to happen in the future. For expressive language, the children can produce shorter or less complex sentences. So they're not going to necessarily talk as things are happening in the past or talk as things could be happening in the future. They might only be able to tell you what's happening in the present or describe things as if they're happening in the present. They can also speak without the use of morphological features, so they might leave off plural s or past tense ed, or the auxiliary is or the article the. There are other morphemes that they could leave off, but those are kind of the common ones. For syntax, we're arranging the words to form meaningful sentences. So for receptive language, these children could have trouble following verbal instructions. And think about how we can change a sentence from a command or from a statement to a command. So, put your shoes on versus your shoes are on. Or, go to the grocery store versus did you go to the grocery store? We can even make it a question. And these children might not understand the difference between those sentences. For expressive language, they could have trouble putting sentences in proper word order, or they could have shorter or incomplete sentences. For semantics, we're really talking about vocabulary, whether it's at the word level, the phrase level, or the sentence level. So for receptive language, they could have a slow growth of vocabulary. And this again goes back to maybe these kids are making it along elementary school and into middle school, but when they get to high school and you're really taking more of these challenging vocabulary tests that are using words that are not in our common vocabulary and in our conversational vocabulary, how are they learning those skills, and can they learn that new vocabulary? They can also have difficulty understanding the meanings of words, either new words or words that are common in conversation, and they can have difficulty requesting for clarification. This can relate back to them not knowing that they don't know the meaning of the word. They could get frustrated and walk away, they could throw a tantrum, they could ignore you, and it's just because they don't know what you're saying. They don't understand that vocabulary. On the expressive side, they are more likely to have simpler or more frequently used words. So they're going to lack some of those morphemes. They could also avoid words that are more complex or less common. They can have difficulty producing descriptive narratives. So they might not tell you that the sun was out on Thursday and it didn't rain for 2 days. They might just say the weather's been good. They can also have difficulty answering WH questions. So this is the who, what, where, when, why, how. And that could be, how did Susie spill her tea? Instead of saying she tripped on Joe's foot, they could say she had tater tots on her tray. And it doesn't quite make any sense. For pragmatics, we have the use of language in social situations. So this is related to how we're interacting with our peers, how we're interacting with our teachers, our parents, ourselves, anything like that, where we're in an environment that is a social situation. So for the receptive side, they could have poor attention to the conversation, so they might just walk away in the middle of a conversation or cut you off in the middle of a conversation. They could ignore the speaker. This is, again, walking away or cutting them off. They could have difficulty expressing feelings and personal experiences. Maybe they get upset or angry because you don't understand what they're trying to say, or they can't tell you that they're upset. They might also have a perceived maturity level that's lower than people in their same age peer group. So this might be the 14-year-old who is constantly told, oh, you're acting like a 10-year-old. And it's just because they don't understand what needs to happen in that pragmatic situation. On the expressive side, they could have trouble with turn taking, so it goes back to topic maintenance. Or understanding that someone else needs to talk sometimes. So instead of telling a long story about yourself, maybe you need to ask a question about somebody else in the appropriate time to ask that question. In terms of topic maintenance, they could talk about the same topic for too long, or they could switch topics too quickly. They could have poor narrative skills again, or they could respond in a frustrated, oppositional, or defiant manner. So maybe you've asked them to go put their shoes away, and they throw a tantrum. Maybe that's not the right time to throw a tantrum. Or you're in a social situation and they're overwhelmed with how many people are around them, and so they start acting out because they don't understand what needs to happen with so many people around them.